had been asked by Barry Diller at the new Fox network to do a show, and he had guaranteed me 13 on the air, and he was basically trying to lure high-profile producers away from NBC, CBS, and ABC over to Fox. And the way he was doing it was saying, no pilot, you're on the air, you got 13. I mean, it was like a gift, you know, you didn't have to audition. And in return, you had to go to what Brandon Tartikoff called the coat hanger network, because the only way you could get Fox was if you had a coat hanger on the back of your TV set, you know. And but it was great to have that opportunity. So I had a young writer working for me who had done Hardcastle and McCormick with me. His name was Patrick Hasberg, and he's my co-creator on 21 Jump Street. And so he and I, were coming up with an idea for, the show. And I said to Barry, I want Patrick to do this with me. And he said, fine. And we were coming up with a concept. And in that period of time, somewhere maybe just prior to that, Mike Post, who did a lot of the music on my shows, he did the themes on probably 30 or 38 of my 40 shows that I've done. He was in my office one day and he said, God, the strangest thing happened to me the other day. And I said, well, what was that? And he said, well, my house was robbed. I said, oh, I didn't know that. I'm sorry. He said, yeah. I said, they took a lot of stuff. And he said, it was late at night and the cops had to write out the report. And they said, well, why don't you come down to the police station tomorrow, Hollywood Division, and sign the reports. We'll have them all typed up. So he said, I went down there the next day and I'm waiting for this cop and I'm sitting in the squad room and I look over and there's this kid doing his homework at a desk. And then while I'm watching, this kid reaches behind and pulls out a gun and a badge and throws them in a drawer and kicks it shut. So when the cop came, he said, with my robbery report, I said, who's that? Who's that? And he said, who's that kid? He's doing his homework, but he had a gun. He goes, no, he's not a student. He's one of our by officers. And I said, well, what's a by officer? He said, well, that's what I asked. He said, these are the officers that they pull right out of the academy who are look very young, and they basically send them back into high school to basically work drug cases. I went, God, that's fascinating. I never heard of that before. And he said, neither had I. You should have seen this kid. He said, you would have sworn he was 16 years old. So Patrick and I were working something else up, and I don't even remember what it was, what kind of an idea it was. I completely forgot. So we went to have lunch with the head of drama development at the Fox network, which was Garth Ansir. And Patrick and I pitch our idea at lunch to Garth Ansir, and he's saying to me, it's good. I can see how it would make a great show, but we are basically looking to try and cover a demographic in television that's not being serviced, which is the very, very young demographic. We're talking about 11 to like 17. That demographic is not being targeted, and we feel there's a niche there that we can go in and do. And I think this show is just will skew a little too old. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, I don't want to let this lunch go to waste, So I said, well, I got another idea. And I pitched. I just told him basically what I just told you about the buy program. And he goes, sold. I got in touch with a cop friend of mine, and I said, I understand you got a program down at the LAPD called the Buy Program. And he said, yeah. And I said, well, Patrick Hasberg and I are writing a project kind of loosely based on that, and we'd like to go spend some time with you guys. And they said, yeah, we're kind of short on space, and there's a chapel across the street from the park at Parker Center. It's an old church that we took over, and we're basically running the buy program out of this church. And so Patrick and I go down there, and there's this church with stained glass windows, and these cops, they got it all. You couldn't have thought of a better thing than that for a set. And so our initial title for the show was Jump Street Chapel, which was what Patrick and I originally wanted to call it. And then we made up the name Jump Street because we thought it sounded hip, and but Jump Street Chapel. And then Barry Diller thought it sounded like a religious show, so he made us drop the chapel, and we made it 21 Jump Street. And but we kept the chapel as a set, and that's why. So then we started to talk to the real officers down there about how how it works, you know, and how and they started to tell us about the training process and what it was like for guys who had and gals who had already been in high school, you know, to have to go back and retake chemistry, you know, and all, you know, and we started, the more we started to learn about the real problems. And then if there was, they would say to these officers, we don't want you to be troublemakers, but we don't want you to be apple polishers either. You know, we want you to be C students. And we want you to hang around the edges of trouble, you know, so that you can find out what you need, you know, but at the same time, we don't want you to instigate trouble, because obviously we're not here to cause problems for the school, we're here to solve problems. And then the rule was that they would tell a principal when they had a by officer in the school, but they wouldn't tell them who the officer was. And because they, you know, for reasons of protecting the cover. And so, you know, we kept all of that as part of the stuff. And if one of our officers got into trouble, then he would have to get a mom and a dad to come in and sit in the principal's office with him, and they were just other cops from downtown, you know. And all of those things, you know, the more we learned about how it really worked and how it functioned, the wider and greater it got. And then little details like in training, like where they would bring the officers all in and they'd sit them down, the new recruits that had just come out of the academy that were going to go into school next, you know, in a month, and they were teaching them how to buy drugs and work with, you know, so that they would be, you know, they wouldn't give themselves up as cops. First thing they did was they go into their cars and check all the CDs. You're listening to the wrong stuff. Nirvana's over with, babe. You know, you gotta, and then they would bring them back in and they would say, you know, they'd sit them down and they'd say, why don't you guys go get something to eat? Because everybody isn't here yet. And this was a scam they'd run on these kids. And they'd go and they'd come back a few minutes later. It was always in the morning, and they'd bring coffee and donuts. And the sergeant there in charge of the buy program would take his baton, and he had a garbage pail at the end of the table, and he'd scrape all their coffee and donuts into the garbage pail. And he said, lesson number 1, kids don't drink coffee and eat donuts. It's grease and Cokes for breakfast. You know, so they just start by like reinfecting them with high school and music and language and all of that stuff. And you know, Patrick and I were down there kind of looking at all of this and going, boy, you know, it doesn't get any better than this. So that was how we did it. We basically built it off the real deal. You would basically have open casting calls, and our casting department would be reading people, in this case kids, and they would come in, and you know, I couldn't read everybody because I had 5 shows or 6 shows on the air, but they would come in, the finalists would come in, and we would then pick the ones that we wanted to take to the network, and we'd pick usually 4 or 5 for each part, and then we'd take those actors over to the network, and then we would read the scenes at the network with those actors, and then along with the network we would make a choice on who we would cast in the picture. And that's how we found Holly, that's how we found Destin, that's how we found Peter DeLuise, and we had another guy cast to play Hanson. And Frederick Forrest was, in the first season, was our captain, and that was our cast. And as we were shooting the movie, we realized that we had miscast the character of Hanson. And it was, you know, it was not the actor's fault. The actor is actually an exceptionally good actor, but we had miscast the flavor that we wanted from that actor. From that character, this actor just didn't have. You know, it wasn't what he was going to be able to give you. He could give you other things, but not that. And I started to get calls from Barry Diller saying, you know, I think we made a mistake. And I said, yeah, I think we have 2. And you know, and so we decided that we would, while we were shooting, see if we could upgrade that role. And so I called up to Kennan and I said, board around this guy, redesign the board, give him like 4 days off. We're going to see if we can do something here. If we can't, we're going to stay with him. If not, because he was, as I said, I don't want to denigrate this actor. He's really a fine actor. You know, and, you know, so we started looking, and we went back to a lot of the people that we had originally had, and one of them was Johnny Depp. And Johnny didn't have, you know, much film on him at the time. He'd been in Platoon, but I think the lines that he had 3 or 4 lines had been actually edited out of the final cut, so he was just really an extra in Platoon, or maybe he had 1 line. And so there wasn't much on him. And I actually directed the test. We got another actor in and played some scenes. And we just did one scene after another. Spent like a full day down on a soundstage, and I directed the tests. And at the end, you know, we looked at all the film. We cut them together and looked at the film, and we all decided that Johnny was the one. And we sent him up to Vancouver and replaced this other actor, and then had to reshoot the scenes.
You know what, man? This thing was completely bizarre. I mean, it's like this weird, deviant, aboriginal offshoot, you know?
Let me guess. You stood in the corner and took notes all night.
No, man, I got out there and got into it.
You slammed and I missed it?
Yeah. You get out there and you bash into a bunch of other guys, you sweat a lot. I mean, it's just another subculture, breaking rules, pecking orders, that type of thing.
Johnny Depp is just a simply phenomenal actor. I don't think, you know, we knew how wonderful he was when we hired him. I mean, because it was sort of a panic, you know, hiring. But God, I mean, he gave you so much. He had such a great intensity. He could play comedy. He could play heavy drama. You know, he was likable. And then he caught fire with a Team Mags and all of that. And I mean, he wasn't nuts about the show, I don't think. You know, I mean, he's been pretty vocal in the fact that he thought it was kind of a mediocre show. In fact, it was quite an excellent show. But he was, I think, beginning to realize that he had serious chops as an actor. And I think he was beginning to realize that Marlon Brando wasn't going to be on the cover of next week's Teen Beat, you know, and that maybe he shouldn't be there either, and that the show wasn't sort of taking him where he wanted to go, and so I think it was a little frustrating for him. But boy, I'll tell you, Johnny he lived up to his contract. He knew his words. He came to play every day. Total pro. Every one of these actors that got chosen was the best at the readings of anybody that came through. I mean, it was not. I had no favorites, nor did Patrick, nor did the network. These were competitive readings. It was like a trial for the Olympics. You know, I mean, the best one wins, and yeah, I mean, the network had to agree. And the actor had to be up. When we took them to the network, they couldn't freeze, they couldn't lock, you know, because if they did, then they weren't going to get it, you know. But, you know, so that was all it was. I mean, Holly was the best, you know, to play Huffs of any of the actors. And Penhall was, you know, from the time that DeLuise came in, he was Penhall. He just had the humor that we wanted for that character. Plus, he had real leading man potential. You know, he was a really good-looking guy in a completely different way from Johnny. And Dustin was probably the least trained as an actor, but had real natural beats and was just an amazingly handsome young man. And he played out. One of the things, it's not so much true now, but back then, Asian actors had a tendency to be very internal because their culture is internal, you know, and that doesn't work sometimes with film. You need an actor that can play out. You need an actor that comes across, and Dustin could play out. And you know, so we hired him, and he turned out to be great. He was a wonderful actor. Steve had been an actor that I had just finished doing an episode of Stingray that I had written called The Greeter, and Steve had been the guest star lead in that movie, and I just thought he was amazing. And so when we were at the place where we were going to replace Frederick, you know, I said, I got the guy, and I brought Steve in.
Lauren, I know there's no house in Connecticut, no horse, no father. I know what you're doing. Let me tell you something. What I do is no different from what every other woman winds up doing. It's a lot different. Most women don't sell their bodies, Lauren. Like heck they don't. They just sell it for high-priced dinners, theater tickets, mink coat, and maybe even a wedding ring.
We did issues. We decided to do issues. We made that choice that we were going to do issues, and that we weren't going to preach about them. And, you know, child molestation, we did a show on that. Guns in the Classroom, we did a show on that.